Alright, so this is just going to be a quick review of the study guide for Exam 3. So Exam 3 is going to be just like Exams 1 and 2. It's going to be multiple choice, true, false, and matching. Also, this is a good time to remind you that Exam 4 is going to be our proctored exam. So at some point next week, I'm going to get that set up where you can go in and sign up for time to take the proctored exam. I'll shoot an email out with that information in it. But Exam 4 will be multiple choice, true, false, and matching as well, but it will be the proctored exam. So more on that to come. But Exam 3 will not be a proctored exam, which means there will not be a password required. There'll be the extra credit practice exam kind of thing that'll be posted for you as well. Alright, so Exam 3 is going to cover our last 3 lectures on Allport, McCrae and Costa, and Eysenck. So just kind of briefly hitting the highlights here, Allport had this view of personality, that personality is somewhat dynamic, so there has to be room for it to be changing, but that personality is not just something that is, but it's also something that does. So we're going to see personality reflected in a person's behavior, and Allport is going to emphasize the importance of consciousness. So Allport suggested that there are parts of your personality that are unconscious, but that those are primarily kind of childhood things, or maybe psychological illness might involve unconscious motivations. But he suggested that a healthy adult individual is going to be driven by conscious motivations, conscious parts of their personality. He suggested that healthy individuals are the ones who include other people in their lives. So we talked about the extension of self, where who you are is not just caught up in yourself, but also in your relationships with other people. He talked about having warm, healthy relationships with others, being accepting of yourself, kind of emotionally stable, and having a realistic view of the world, so being able to see things for how they truly are. Now, Allport had this idea of a personal disposition, kind of a particular personality trait. I use the word trait here loosely since we're going to be talking about trait theory, and Allport would not be a trait theorist per se. He suggested that there are personality characteristics, just like the trait theory suggested, but Allport, on the other hand, said that each individual is going to have different traits. There are no such thing as universal theories of personality. Each theory of personality needs to be specific to an individual. So the personality traits that you have will be different from the personality traits that I have or that someone else has. And he suggested there were kind of 3 levels here. So we can have cardinal dispositions or cardinal traits that are basically our ruling passions. And he said not everyone has those, but for someone who has them, that's going to be a huge part of their personality. And then he suggested there were central traits, that most people have 5 to 10 traits, that this is basically how your friends would describe you, the parts of your personality that seem to be most obvious to other people. And then we have, of course, maybe the cardinal traits, if you have them, will be most obvious, but beyond your overruling passion, the parts of your personality that seem to be most obvious. And then your secondary dispositions or traits are going to be those things that are not obvious, those little nuances to who you are that a person might not know if they hadn't spent quite a bit of time around you. Okay? So then when he's talking about dispositions, he says there's a difference here, that some dispositions are motivational and some are stylistic. If a disposition is motivational, it means it directly impacts your behavior. It gives you a push to initiate behavior, right? So if there is a personality trait that is motivational, it means it's going to cause you to go out and behave in a certain way because of that. Stylistic, on the other hand, is more that you have this personality disposition that, when you find yourself in a certain situation, guides your behavior a little bit, but doesn't directly cause your behavior, like the motivational ones would. Okay, so Allport's use of the word proprium basically is a way of saying the self, right? His way of saying the self, or the proprium is kind of like the core of who you are, right? The characteristics that are most central to your life, right? Yourself, your personality, basically. Now, Allport really focused on morphogenic research, which means he liked to have one person at a time, very small sample size, sit down and study in depth. So basically do a case study with a very small number of people. On the other hand, nomothetic research is one in which you have several different participants, a large sample size, if you will, which he did not particularly like that kind of research, which is going to be different from what we're going to see in the other 2 theorists. And then specifically, Allport talked about religion. he suggested that there are intrinsic and extrinsic religion, like beliefs, basically. An individual who is intrinsically religious is someone who goes through their religious practices, basically, because they want to, because they genuinely enjoy them, or because they find peace from doing so. On the other hand, someone who has more of an extrinsic way of looking at religion is someone who goes through them because they've always done it, or because it's expected of them, or they go to their religious services so they can socialize, that kind of thing. And what he found was that individuals were more likely to be healthy and happy if they had intrinsic religious beliefs, more so. The individuals who had an extrinsic approach to religion were less likely than the typical person to be healthy and happy. They also found that the individuals with extrinsic religious beliefs were more likely to be kind of cruel, or to look down on other people, to judge other people a little bit more, whereas individuals who had an intrinsic way of looking at religion were a little bit less likely to treat people that way. And you can look at the critiques and the concepts there. McCrae and Costa and Eysenck were both trait theorists, suggesting that there was a certain number of universal personality traits, and those universal personality traits would be found in all individuals. You're either going to be high or low on each one of them. They determined their number of traits based on factor analysis, statistical method, trying to boil down all of these different personality measures to get down to the very heart of what they were measuring. McCrae and Costa suggested that there were 5, right? So we have openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism were the 5. And so these are bipolar traits, which means that we have very different look from one end to the other end, like extroversion and introversion, for example, or someone who's open to experience versus someone who's closed to experience is going to look very different for them. They suggested, and Eysenck did as well, that because these traits are universal, they should be found in all cultures. They should be fairly stable throughout the lifespan, and both McCrae and Costa and Eysenck did find that that was the case. We're talking specifically about McCrae and Costa. As we said, they had the big five personality theorists. They suggested that we have these core components. So basic tendencies are like the raw materials of personality that you're born with. And according to McCrae and Costa, that's based on biology. So this biological basis for basic tendencies. But then you also have this characteristic adaptation, the parts of your personality that have come up because they help you to be successful in your particular environment. Also, part of who you are is your self-concept, so the way that you see yourself and think about yourself. Are you happy with yourself? That kind of thing. So we talked about how this comes from biology. It also comes from experience. So objective biography has to do with all of the different experiences that you've had throughout your life, every thought you've ever had, every behavior you've ever done, that kind of thing, as well as external influences. All of these things can impact the core components of your personality. Okay. We talked a little bit about research on the Big Five. Specifically, we said that individuals who are conscientious are more likely to have good grades. They're more likely to be successful as far as their GPA is concerned. But we found that that was not true of their SAT scores or standardized testing. So that's kind of the thought, that we can be conscientious or someone who's very responsible and very dependable. That can cause us to be successful because we set deadlines, work hard, go to class, take notes. And it's possible for an individual to be successful based on their conscientiousness when it comes to something like taking a college class, whereas something like the SAT or other standardized testing, really conscientiousness is not related to that, right? And I think I mentioned this during the Eysenck video, but there's also been research to suggest that neuroticism is actually sometimes an asset because these individuals are more likely to double, triple check their work, more likely to make sure to turn their work in on time, so that can actually improve as well. So review that. And then Eysenck, the last one that we talked about, we said that Eysenck had more strict criteria for personality factors. It wasn't just based on factor analysis, although factor analysis was a place to start, but it also had to make sense from a genetic standpoint. It had to make sense from a theoretical standpoint. It had to be socially relevant. And so if it met all of those criteria, it was in, which is why Eysenck only had 3 superfactors, which is basically what he called traits. Superfactors here. So remember that he said sometimes we have specific behaviors And then like one layer out from that, we have habitual behaviors, so what we do on a pretty regular basis. And then one layer out from that, we have what he called traits, which is really kind of like central dispositions, kind of those things that would describe you in general terms. And then one layer out from that is where we have what he would call super factors, where we had extroversion, neuroticism, and psychoticism, right? And we said that this is probably biological in nature. So, for example, an individual who is extroverted is, based on our research, also someone who has a low level of arousal. And then that individual, based on that low level of arousal, is more likely to seek additional arousal. On the other hand, an introverted person is someone who probably has a naturally high level of arousal, so they're less likely to seek out that extra experience there. We also said that an individual that's high in neuroticism is more likely to have a very sensitive or perhaps overactive sympathetic nervous system, whereas someone who is lower on neuroticism, someone who's a little bit more emotionally stable, does not tend to have the overreactive sympathetic nervous system there as well. Remember that he said that psychoticism is a little bit less caused by biology, although it is still strongly related to biology, but not quite as much as the other two, authoritarian parenting being especially related to psychoticism. All right. Personality and health, we talked about how your behaviors that can potentially improve or hurt your health are related to your personality. We said that individuals who had been diagnosed with cancer typically were more likely to survive if they had that mentality of, I'm not going to let this beat me, I'm not going to be hopeless, I'm going to have hope, I'm going to have optimism, I'm going to fight back, kind of almost like getting angry at the disease. On the other hand, individuals who have a heart condition or a health condition that is impacting their heart health, they actually were less likely to survive if they had that kind of angry, aggressive approach towards that. We could see then that if someone who is already having heart problems gets overly aroused or angry, that can make heart problems worse. Okay? So take a look at that. Basically, the critiques, when we're talking about trait theory in general, it's very high on research, but not always as high on falsifiability, not always as high on like practically guiding what we do. Concept of humanity here, especially with, I think we're going to see biological in nature, so take a look at that. This has just been a really quick overview. If you have any questions, feel free to come by during my office hours or shoot me an email. There will also be that practice exam for extra credit that'll be available. Make sure that you take exam 3 before it closes. And just let me know if you need anything. Otherwise, I will talk to you guys next time.